One of the biggest mistakes that I see writers make when they finish their book and write the resolution is they suffer from ending fatigue. What is ending fatigue? Well, I'll give you a hint. One of my all-time favorite stories, and a very popular one, The Lord of the Rings, suffers from this problem. To get the full scoop, stay tuned because we're starting right now. Hello everyone, my name is David Webb and I made this channel to give you the best tips on writing and creativity so you can finally finish your book or have that creative career you've always dreamed of. As promised, we are continuing this week on the discussion of endings, specifically the resolution of your book. What is the resolution? Well, it's that short period after the climax leading up to the final page of the book where you tie everything up in a nice neat little bow and everything is, for lack of a better word, resolved. It is a very important part of your story. If you've ever studied music at any length, you'll know that a song doesn't quite feel right if a chord is not resolved. Taking the narrative of the music, or in this case a book, from dissonance to consonance. In book terms, taking the narrative from conflict to resolution. It's that moment where the reader can finally relax and enjoy the final pages of your book. So, as you can imagine, it is a pretty important part of your story. Before I go any further, you should know that there are two main types of resolutions with plenty more subsets and a lot of caveats, but today we're going to be focusing on those main two. And that is the resolved ending and the unresolved ending. The resolved path being the one that most standalone books take, where almost every plot line is resolved and most threads are not left hanging, and the unresolved endings where there is a resolution, but there are still loose threads. There are plot lines left open, and this is, as you can guess, typically what you do when you're ending a book in the middle of a series. Take Harry Potter, for instance. The main conflict is resolved. The Sorcerer's Stone is found, but Voldemort is still out there and he is coming back. There are other kinds of endings, such as the ambiguous ending where the reader is left to guess as to what actually happened in the end. Themes and plot lines are implied but not overtly stated. This and other resolutions are not as common, but they do exist, but they are very special cases, and honestly deserve a video of their own. So now that we've defined different kinds of resolutions, let's get into how to make your resolutions shine. First up, no matter what kind of resolution you write, you need to make sure to tie up your character arcs. As you know by now, the reader's journey is directly tied to the emotional character arcs of the protagonists. Most well-written stories draw the reader in and connect them to their characters. As I've stated before, character, not plot, is the most important thing in your story. Therefore, you need to make sure that your story and your character arcs have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even if you're writing a series, you need to contain each character arc to each individual story. Yes, there can be a larger character arc that can span books and books. But in order to keep the reader grounded, in order to bring it all back to a close at the end of a book and make it satisfying, you do need to make sure that there are individual character arcs, just like you have individual storylines that are tied up at the end of each book. Next up, even if you are writing a series, tie up the plot. Just like the character arc, you do need to tie up the plot. Yes, you can write a cliffhanger. Yes, you can include a massive plot twist. But the main story of each individual book does need to have an ending. It needs a climax and a resolution. Books without resolutions can be exhausting to read. It's usually unsatisfactory. The reader doesn't get the same sense of fulfillment as they do when they read a book that has a clear, defined resolution. So just like your character arcs, you do need to tie up most of your plot lines. Next up, do not wait too long to end your book. This is what I referred to in the introduction of the video as ending fatigue, and it's where you take the climax and the very end of your book and you slap a massive resolution between it, going on for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of words. Yes, you do need to tie up your plot lines and your character arcs, but if you spend chapters upon chapters between your climax and the very end of your book, it's almost equally as exhausting, bordering upon boring. The emotional high of the climax is hit, and if you don't end your book while the reader is still feeling just a little bit of that, your ending will tend to fall flat. A great example of this is The Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite stories of all time in print and in film. It suffers from a rather severe case of ending fatigue, again, both in book and in film. Now, I will say that the way in which J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, it was a very different style than the movie, and a very unique style all on its own. So I hesitate to criticize the book too much, but if you read it, you get the emotional high, the thrill, the adrenaline of the ring finally being destroyed. and then you have a large part of the book dedicated to their journey back home, and then a whole other plot line where the hobbits take back the Shire. Yes, it's interesting, but the main storyline was destroying the ring. That was the main climax. Everything that comes after should be resolution, but instead you get another half climax. And yes, you could argue that this battle for the Shire is more important to the hobbits because they take a bigger role in it. And really, that's the only thing that keeps me from truly criticizing this book, because even from the very onset of the series, it started with the hobbits. It's the hobbits' journey. But in my opinion, it does stretch on too long, and the reader does risk just tossing the book away because the main storyline is over and there's no end in sight. The movies, however, have no excuse. Yes, I get that The Return of the King is over 3 hours long, over 4 hours long if you're watching the extended cut. Someone fact-checked me on that. But even with a runtime of that long, The Return of the King is infamous for its long, drawn-out ending that just doesn't end. I remember watching it in the theaters when I was a kid and being confused yet a little bit relieved that there was no battle for the Shire like there was in the books, but being even more confused that the ending just seemed to go on. I'm not saying that it wasn't satisfying or fun to watch, but it did stretch on. All that to say, avoid this issue, make your resolutions on the shorter side, but make them satisfying. Next up is you want to avoid the opposite problem and do not make your resolution too short. If you've watched this entire video up until now, you can kind of guess as to why, but a story without a resolution, or a story with a very short and not complete resolution, isn't as satisfying. After all I've said so far, I don't think I need to dwell on this, but let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions. Next up, a key concept that can make your entire book shine is if you know the end from the beginning. If you start writing your book knowing what the end is going to be, you can insert additional ideas or plot lines or themes throughout the entire book that tie up in an incredibly satisfying way in the very end. Because the resolution is where the reader can sit back and reflect upon the entire journey, if you include callouts in the resolution to the entire rest of the book that give additional perspective or light to the narrative that the reader just experienced, it can be incredibly satisfying. However, I wouldn't go overboard with this because if you do, you'll stretch on the resolution and run into the problem of ending fatigue. Next up, if you are writing a resolved ending, like in a standalone book where everything is tied up at the end, you do not need to explain everything. This is a little bit tricky because readers might come at you and accuse you of plot holes or not answering all their questions. And yes, you do have free reign as the writer to explain what you want and what you don't want, meaning that if you do want to make things somewhat ambiguous or imply certain things from the plot, you can leave things open-ended. And if you are writing an ambiguous ending, you can leave it completely open-ended. But assuming you do want to write a resolved ending, just because you don't explain something doesn't mean that it's a plot hole. And again, I cannot stress enough to be extra careful with this, because assuming you do want to sell your books and make it as an author, you do need to serve the reader. You're not just writing for yourself. And if a reader does expect something to be explained, it should, in most cases, be explained. Again, if you are writing a resolved ending. So I mentioned this just so that it is in the back of your mind. Yes, you don't have to explain everything, but be careful. And then finally, a word on twist endings. Be extra careful with this as well, especially in a resolved story where there is no sequel. Twist endings can be great in the middle of a series, and I'll talk about that in another video, but you shouldn't write a twist ending just to have a twist ending. Especially in the resolution of a standalone book, a twist ending does not offer too much to the story unless it changes the perspective with which you read the entire rest of the book, making you reflect on what you just read and thinking about it in a whole new light. And even then, they can get overused and overdone. My all-time favorite example of a twist ending that went wrong is in the Nicholas Sparks story Safe Haven, I think it's called. I'm not looking it up because I don't want to relive the horrible memories of being forced to watch this movie by my terrible ex-girlfriend. If you haven't read this book or seen the movie and you want to experience the twist for yourself, turn this video off now because I just want to get it off my chest. Although I will warn you now, it's not worth watching. This was probably the worst ending to any story I have ever seen in my entire life. At the end of the movie, after a somewhat compelling tale of a woman escaping her abusive boyfriend or husband or something, it's revealed that the close friend of the protagonist is a ghost, and she's been watching over her throughout the entire story because the protagonist has fallen in love with the dead woman's husband or something. It was ridiculous. It was laughable. I don't remember if I laughed or if I cried because it was so idiotic when I first watched it. What I do remember is going on what must have been an hour-long rant after I watched the movie about how it was so stupid. To be honest, I don't remember if it was foreshadowed. I've intentionally forgotten most of that movie. But even if it was foreshadowed, it added nothing to the plot. It was literally a twist ending for the sake of a twist ending. And that, in a phrase, is how I would sum up the kind of twist ending you don't want to write. A twist ending just for the sake of having a twist ending. And then, of course, foreshadow them and make them make sense. And with that mini rant, that is going to close up today's video on resolutions. I've decided to make a different video on how to end books in the middle of a series because you take a completely different strategy with it. Other than that, that's gonna do it for me today. Thank you again for watching. My name is David Webb. Can't wait to see you all again and get some writing done. So I'm sitting here editing the next day and I realized that I forgot to say the fancy French word that some people use to describe the resolution. So, denouement. There you go.